let's think about the costs of net zero. Now, think about yourself as an individual. You can work out your emissions. There's websites you can go on. You can work out what your CO2 emissions and CO2 equivalent emissions are per year. And so, just to give you some context, for us in the UK, we are about 5 tons per person per year. And that will vary, right? So, if you're someone who has a very environmentally friendly lifestyle, maybe you'll be closer to one or something like that. If you're someone who flies around a lot and that sort of thing, maybe you're closer to 20 or something, so this will vary. But obviously in the UK, we've got a lot of wind power, so our carbon emissions tend to be lower from the electricity that we use. In the USA, I believe it's around sort of 14 or 15 per person. So but some people might be, up at 50 or something like that if they do a lot of flying, as I say, if they eat a lot of meat, all these kinds of things. And maybe if it's a small company, we could work it out like this for companies as well. Here are the costs at different prices for ton of carbon. So the social cost of carbon, the higher this is, the more obviously it's going to cost you if you're charged carbon tax based on your carbon pollution. So if it's cheap social cost of carbon, if it's $50, and obviously it's the same if it's pounds or euros or whatever, it's just you're just multiplying. So if it's £50, then that person who's got just 1 ton of emission a year, then their annual cost of this tax would be £50. If you've got that really high polluting person, theirs is going to be £2,500 a year. So maybe they're quite a rich person and they could afford to spend every year £2,500 for their carbon tax. But let's say, like I was saying, as time goes on, we use up the cheap options to reduce our carbon emissions, and then we start to have to do the more expensive things. And eventually, we run out of the really cheap stuff, and the eventual point, I think, is that we're going to have to suck the CO2 out of the air. That's where we're going to head. And how much is that going to cost? Well, at the moment, it's off the chart. And maybe it could come down to 1,000 tons. Some people might say it'll get less than that. Maybe it'll drop to 500. I don't see why it would, but maybe they know something I don't. But let's say it went up to $1,000 or whatever your currency is, a ton of CO2. If you're that 1 ton person, you're suddenly paying $1,000 a year for your carbon tax. If you're that average UK person, you've got 5 tons of CO2, you're going to have to pay £5,000 a year in tax just for the carbon, not including all your other taxes and everything like that. So that's quite a big difference. If you're that really sort of high emitting person, yours is going to go up from 2,500 to 50,000 a year. 50,000 a year you will pay to do your pollution. Now, obviously, as I've said, the cost is going up as time goes on, but what we can try and do is reduce where we are as time goes on. So if you're at this 50 point stage and it's $50 a ton, let's say you're in the States, what are your options here? Well, you might start to think, well, in that case, I will just change certain things about my lifestyle or about my infrastructure that I use or something like that. I'll get a heat pump, get an EV, whatever it is. I'll start to use cleaner electricity or something like that. You can then move yourself up the table, as it were, down in cost, depending how you look at the table. But yeah, you would go in this direction here so that as time goes on, although the price has gone up, it's gone up 10 times, let's say, from $50 to $500, but you're still paying the same because you've dropped your emissions from 50 tons a year down to 5 tons a year. So you've gone from that really high emitting position to modest emissions. And then, even though the price of the carbon has gone up, your annual cost has stayed the same. So we're moving, along this way over time. The social cost of carbon is going to go up. That's the way we're going. And then, so what we all need to do to move ourselves from the more high levels of emission over time, move ourselves into the lower levels of emission. So we can move ourselves, you know, down on here. Maybe we can even, end up with a lower bill because we'll reduce our emissions so much. So there's this idea, the government is adding all these costs on with all this net zero stuff, but I just don't see it like that at all.